Even though he didn't drink, smoke, or drive his own car, he quit breathing at the age of 42.
Elvis Presley's body had barely arrived at Baptist Memorial Hospital when the murmurs began. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, everyone in that hallway felt it. This wasn't just another high-profile death. This was the moment the myth of invincibility surrounding the king of rock and roll shattered, and the truth lying underneath was far worse than anyone expected. The pilot, the bodyguards, the paramedics, they all told their version, but none of them saw what the autopsy team saw when they unzipped the bag and looked at the man the world had worshipped for 2 decades. The truth hit them long before the autopsy even began. Elvis Presley hadn't died suddenly. His body had been fighting a war for years. One doctor later said, "It was like examining a man twice his age." And he meant it. Inside the hospital, chaos erupted. No one even knew who was technically in charge. Phone lines were already blowing up. Staff were being pulled from other departments. Security officers were told to block every hallway leading to the morgue. Reporters were circling the building within minutes. Some insiders whispered that the governor's office was already calling. People wanted answers, and fast. But the team performing the autopsy didn't want speed. They wanted truth. And the truth was not something the public was prepared to hear. The lead pathologist stepped forward and took a breath before beginning. He knew this would be the most scrutinized autopsy in American history. Every line in the report would be examined, questioned, doubted. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to uncover. Because the moment they examined Elvis's torso, the tone changed. The room went still. The doctor stared at what he was seeing, and all he said, quietly, was, "This isn't what we were told." Elvis's outward appearance, what the fans saw at concerts, on planes, outside Graceland, didn't reveal the full picture. But up close, under the harsh morgue lights, the signs were undeniable. His organs told a story of long-term suffering. His skin revealed years of swelling and inflammation. His stomach showed something that stunned the medical team so deeply that several of them looked at each other in disbelief. Whatever the official story would later claim, Elvis Presley had been in a catastrophic physical decline. Yet while the doctors were realizing this, the administrators upstairs were panicking. They demanded to know what the autopsy would say, what the official cause of death should be, how much of the truth should be released, and whether certain details, especially the sensitive ones, should be left out entirely. One nurse overheard someone mutter, "We can't put that on the report. Do you know what that will do to his legacy?" But in the autopsy room, legacy didn't matter. Fame didn't matter. Myth didn't matter. All that mattered was what was in front of them, the unfiltered reality of Elvis Presley's final years. Before the first incision was even made, the doctor already knew the public version of Elvis's death would be incomplete. Too many people had motives. Too many reputations were at stake. Too many careers had relied on Elvis continuing to perform, continue the tours, continue the money machine, no matter the cost to his own health. But the doctor could not ignore the one question that kept tightening his chest. How long had Elvis been suffering like this? And why hadn't anyone stopped him? When the autopsy finally began, the room was silent. No chatter, no rushing. Every person present understood they were about to uncover what really killed Elvis Presley. Not just the sudden moment in the bathroom, but the years of silent deterioration leading up to it. Minutes into the examination, the pathologist paused again. His eyes widened slightly. He looked at another physician and said, almost in disbelief. This is much worse than anyone imagined. That's when the staff realized the truth wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't going to fit neatly into a headline. It wasn't going to comfort fans. It was going to expose a long chain of medical issues, mismanagement, and suffering that had been hidden from the world. The hospital tried to prepare a statement, but they couldn't write one fast enough to keep up with what the autopsy was revealing inside that locked room. And the most shocking part? They hadn't even reached the internal organs yet, because the real horror, the discovery that would change everything, was waiting inside Elvis's stomach. And when the doctor finally opened it, he knew immediately that the world had been told only half the truth. The doctor's hand stopped the moment he opened Elvis Presley's stomach. Even in a career spent examining the most heartbreaking cases imaginable, he had never seen anything like this. Not in someone Elvis's age, not in someone with his resources, not in someone who was supposed to be surrounded by the best medical care in the world. The first thing he noticed was the extraordinary amount of undigested medication. Not one or two pills, dozens. Enough that one assistant quietly whispered, This can't be right." But it was right. Elvis's body had been overwhelmed by a pharmaceutical storm he wasn't built to survive. The official story later softened it, polished it, turned it into something vague. But the truth staring back at the doctors was brutal. Elvis's digestive system had slowed to a near standstill. His colon was distended, his intestines strained, his stomach packed with medication his body could no longer process. This wasn't a man who overdosed recklessly. This was a man whose body had been collapsing for years. The doctor moved through the examination slowly, methodically, the way a man does when each discovery hits harder than the last. Elvis's heart, enlarged to nearly twice the normal size, carried the weight of relentless strain. His liver showed signs of chronic stress. His arteries were thickened, scarred from a lifetime of pressure, pain, and exhaustion. But what struck the team wasn't just the physical breakdown, it was the cause behind it. Elvis Presley had been prescribed medication at a level no human being should have endured. Painkillers, sleeping aids, stimulants, sedatives, often stacked on top of each other, each one intended to fix the damage the previous one created. A cycle that echoed the life he was forced to live. Perform, recover, repeat. The public liked to imagine Elvis as careless, out of control, indulgent. The autopsy told a different story entirely. Elvis wasn't chasing a high. He was chasing relief. Relief from chronic pain, nerve trouble, insomnia, debilitating fatigue, and the crushing weight of a career that no longer felt like his own. One doctor quietly said he wasn't living on pills. He was surviving on them. And even that survival was beginning to fail. Elvis's colon was in such a compromised state that it stunned the medical examiner. Years of slowed digestion, dehydration, and medication buildup had created a condition that would have caused discomfort so severe it was almost unimaginable. Yet Elvis kept performing, kept touring, kept smiling for crowds that never knew the agony hidden beneath the jumpsuits and the spotlight. His veins told another story. Years of injections, medical treatments administered on the road, last-minute fixes to keep him upright for a show he should have been resting from. His organs were aging faster than he was. His systems were collapsing silently. And the people around him, the ones scheduling non-stop performances, had ignored every warning sign. But it was the second layer of the autopsy that deepened the tragedy. because Elvis's internal health didn't show the recklessness of a man who gave up. It became clear that Elvis wasn't just sick. He was being managed in a way that prioritized the show over the man. The autopsy doctor later admitted it felt like reading the medical history of someone who wasn't allowed to stop. And that was the problem. Elvis wasn't allowed to stop. He'd tell close friends he was afraid he wouldn't wake up after the shows. He'd whisper to bodyguards that the pain in his chest scared him. He'd admit privately that he could feel something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. But every time he tried to slow down, someone reminded him of the contract, the schedule, the money, the expectations. The public thought Elvis was unpredictable. In truth, he was trapped, and the autopsy revealed just how long he had been paying the price. While examining Elvis's spine and nerve pathways, the doctor found signs of chronic, untreated pain that would have made ordinary life difficult, let alone performing on stage under blinding lights for 2 hours. The nerve damage connected to years of stress, injury, and medication side effects. Then came another revelation. Elvis's heart had been struggling for far longer than anyone admitted publicly. Early signs of cardiomyopathy were present. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't random. It was a years-long progression that had been masked, ignored, or minimized. Some members of Elvis's inner circle had known he was sick, but they didn't know how sick. And the ones who did know didn't stop the machine. One assistant coroner later said, "It felt like we were looking at the body of a man who'd been asked to lift a mountain every day." The doctor examining the heart murmured, "This could have been prevented." Not prevented as in immortality. Prevented as in this level of collapse. But what haunted the medical team the most wasn't the physical damage. It was the emotional truth behind it. Because buried in Elvis's medical file was a handwritten note from a physician, a note written months earlier. It read, "Patient expresses fear of dying alone. Recommends extended rest. Request denied." Denied! Denied because of the tour. Denied because of commitments. Denied because Elvis Presley wasn't treated like a patient. He was treated like a product. The autopsy doctor felt anger rising as he continued his work. Elvis hadn't been reckless. He hadn't been careless. He had been drowning in a system that looked at him and saw dollar signs instead of symptoms. But the most disturbing moment came when the doctor reached a detail that would eventually be sealed away, locked behind legal walls for decades. It wasn't a single organ. It wasn't a single pill. It wasn't a single diagnosis. It was the pattern. Every major condition Elvis had, heart weakness, colon dysfunction, nerve issues, chronic inflammation, medication overload, should have triggered an emergency intervention years earlier. But instead of intervention, Elvis received more pressure, more shows, more expectations, more pills to keep him going just long enough to get through the next performance. The doctor realized something devastating. Elvis didn't die in a moment. He died over time, piece by piece, under the weight of a schedule no human could endure. And as the team finished their notes, one question hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Who failed Elvis Presley more? His body or the people who refused to let him rest? The doctor knew the answer. He also knew the public wasn't ready to hear it, because the next part of the autopsy, the part that would be sealed, exposed exactly how preventable Elvis's fate truly was. And decades later, when those sealed findings resurfaced, they revealed the part of Elvis's final story the world was never meant to know. The last section of Elvis Presley's autopsy report, the part locked away for decades, didn't just describe what killed him. It explained why his final day unfolded the way it did. And for the medical examiner, it was the most painful truth of all. Elvis had been living on borrowed time long before August 16, 1977. To understand what the autopsy found, you have to understand what happened in the final hours of Elvis's life. That morning at Graceland was unusually quiet. Elvis had barely slept the night before. Another long night of restlessness, pacing, discomfort he couldn't fully articulate. His closest aides knew something was off. They had seen him tired before, seen him weak, seen him frustrated. But this was different. His breathing was heavier. His face looked strained. Even his voice carried a dullness, like a man forcing himself through every step. He tried reading. He tried talking. He tried distraction after distraction, but nothing settled him. His body was begging for rest, but his mind wouldn't allow it. He was trapped in that cycle again. Pain, sleeplessness, medication, and the crushing pressure to appear okay. And the autopsy would later reveal why that pressure became unbearable. One of the most significant findings in the sealed section was the condition of Elvis's heart. Not just enlarged, not just strained. It was the heart of a man fighting a long, losing battle. The report described damage consistent with years of overwork, inflammation, and systemic stress. It didn't belong to a man in his early 40s. It belonged to a man decades older, worn down long before the world admitted he was struggling. The second revelation was even more heartbreaking. The colon issues, heavily redacted from public versions, were far more severe than anyone knew. His digestive system had essentially stopped functioning properly. The pain, the swelling, the distension, it wasn't a recent development. It was the result of years of dysfunction that had never been treated aggressively, never been given the time or care it demanded. The medical examiner understood instantly. Elvis had been living with pain few people could endure. And then came the medications, the thing tabloids turned into mockery, but the autopsy revealed with chilling clarity. Elvis wasn't abusing pills for fun. He was using them because his body was shutting down. Sleeping was nearly impossible. Eating became unpredictable. Performing was an ordeal. He survived only because he forced himself through it. Every prescription was an attempt to solve a different problem, but together, they created a storm inside him that no body could withstand. That morning at Graceland, when Elvis went into the bathroom and told Ginger he was going to read, he wasn't escaping. He wasn't hiding. He was trying to settle the pain. He was trying to make his body relax long enough to breathe normally. His final moments weren't dramatic. They weren't reckless. They were quiet, tragically quiet. A man exhausted beyond imagination. A man whose body had finally reached the limit of what it could carry. When the autopsy doctor connected the timeline with the physical evidence, everything clicked. Elvis had not died from a single cause. He died from all of it: the heart strain, the digestive collapse, the chronic pain, the endless cycle of medication, the unmanaged conditions, the mental and physical exhaustion. He died because he had been pushed past the edge long before that morning. And that's why the sealed portion of the autopsy mattered so much. It didn't hide wrongdoing. It hid the cruelty of the machine around him. Because if the world had seen how broken his body truly was, how much damage had been ignored or minimized, it would have forced people to confront the truth. Elvis didn't die because he let himself go. He died because he kept pushing when every part of him was begging for rest. He died trying to live up to a legend. The medical examiner later admitted he never forgot the sight of Elvis's heart, not because of the damage, but because it symbolized something larger. Elvis didn't die of excess, he said. He died of effort. The effort to perform, the effort to please, the effort to carry a world that never let him put it down. When the sealed findings were finally revisited years later, they revealed exactly what the doctor feared. Elvis had been fighting a losing war alone, while everyone around him insisted the show must go on. In the end, the autopsy didn't just tell the world how Elvis died, it told the world how much he suffered while he lived. Now that the truth behind Elvis's final hours and sealed autopsy is finally understood, what do you think his story reveals about fame, pressure, and being pushed beyond human limits? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more untold Elvis stories, hit subscribe for the next deep dive.
He was using some local anesthetic, some Novocaine something, and he was putting some Demerol in there and a little B12 in there, and gosh, he felt great afterwards, you know.
He waited more than 40 years to say it, not because he was scared of the truth, but because of the promise he made to the man the world called a king. I didn't just lose a patient that night, the doctor says now, his voice thin with age but steady with purpose. I broke a promise I made to him, and I've carried that weight longer than anyone knows. For decades, Elvis Presley's doctor watched the world stitch together its own version of what happened. Documentaries, gossip, headlines, arguments about pills and pressure and personal choices. Every time a pundit said he threw his life away, the doctor felt a jolt in his chest because he knew something they didn't. He knew the story wasn't that simple, and the ending wasn't inevitable. He'd seen Elvis in moments no fan, no friend, no manager ever did. Moments stripped of the rhinestones, the fame, the spotlight. He'd seen the exhaustion beneath the legend, the fear behind the charm, and the desperation behind the smile that millions mistook for invincibility. The first time the doctor met him, he expected arrogance. He expected a celebrity who would treat him like staff. Instead, Elvis apologized 3 times in the first 5 minutes. "Sorry to drag you out this late, sir," he said softly, rubbing his forehead. It wasn't the voice of a superstar. It was the voice of a man afraid he was becoming a burden. That impression never left him. The world saw Elvis as untouchable, unstoppable, a force of nature who could command crowds of thousands with a single hip shake. But behind closed doors, the doctor saw a man running himself into the ground, fighting a schedule that didn't care whether he slept, ate, or stood upright. What the public calls decline, the doctor calls something else. A man begging for help in the only ways he knew how. But the machine around Elvis, management, contracts, pressure, didn't leave much room for begging, and that's where the secret begins. The doctor remembers late-night calls from Graceland, not dramatic emergencies, quiet ones. Elvis couldn't sleep. His heart raced. His hands shook. He was tired in a way rest couldn't fix. A normal patient would have canceled everything. But Elvis wasn't allowed to be normal. Every time the doctor suggested rest, someone in the background whispered about commitments, bookings, finances, the colonel. Elvis would lower his eyes and say, "I'll be fine. Just need a little help to get through this run." Those little helps became the doctor's battlefield. He tried adjusting medications, cutting down dangerous combinations, insisting on health tests, even demanding breaks. But every medical suggestion he made ran into the same wall: Elvis's fear of letting people down. The doctor says this part with bitterness. He trusted everyone, and almost no one protected him. For years he stayed quiet, tied by medical confidentiality and trapped by a world that preferred the clean, convenient narrative. Elvis overindulged. Elvis spiraled. Elvis caused his own ending. The doctor says those headlines cut deeper than anyone imagines, because Elvis predicted them. The doctor remembers the night clearly. A quiet room. No entourage, no pressure, just the two of them. Elvis had suffered another episode, exhaustion mixed with panic, mixed with the guilt he carried like a second skin. He sat there, shoulders slumped, eyes red, and he said something the doctor has never repeated until now. If anything happens to me, they're gonna say I did this to myself. They'll never know how hard I tried. The doctor didn't know how to respond. How do you reassure a man who already feels like a myth being pulled apart by the people feeding off him? Elvis asked him for something that night, a request the doctor wasn't sure he could fulfill. Don't let them forget the truth. Promise me. And he promised. But then came the years of silence, the pressure from lawyers, the confidentiality agreements, the fear of sparking lawsuits that would devastate Presley's daughter, and the doctor's own guilt that he might have acted too late, spoken too softly, or walked away when he could have fought harder. So he kept the secret. He watched the world swallow the version of the story that was easiest to digest. He kept that final conversation locked behind his ribs, where it stayed for decades, a weight that grew heavier every time someone called Elvis weak, reckless, or hopeless. And now, older, frailer, and finally willing to break the silence, the doctor says the one thing none of those documentaries ever did. Elvis Presley didn't give up. He didn't roll over. He tried to save himself, and I'm the one who failed him. But he pauses because that isn't the whole secret, not even close. The truth I've carried all these years, he says slowly, isn't about how he died. It's about the one chance I had to save him, and the choice I made that night. He inhales deeply. Everything changed because of that choice. He said the moment that still wakes him at night didn't happen in a hospital or during a crisis. It happened on an ordinary afternoon inside Graceland, an afternoon that revealed just how broken Elvis's world had become. The doctor remembers stepping through the doorway and feeling instantly that something was wrong. Not medically, environmentally. Too many voices, too many demands, too much urgency, all aimed at a man who could barely keep his eyes open. Elvis was slumped on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to his temple, the other clutching a schedule. A schedule, the doctor says, that was an insult to biology. Multiple shows, flights, meetings, rehearsals, no room for sleep, no room for recovery, barely room to breathe. He wasn't declining because he was reckless, the doctor says. He was declining because he was treated like he didn't have a human body. The doctor ordered basic vitals. They weren't just bad, they were alarming. Heart rate, irregular. Blood pressure, unstable. Elvis tried to joke about it, mumbling, "Guess the engine's running hot, Doc." But his hands were trembling, his voice cracked. And when the doctor asked how long he'd felt like this, Elvis whispered, "Longer than I've been allowed to say." The doctor told him firmly that the next series of shows needed to be canceled, not delayed, canceled. Elvis didn't die because he didn't care. He died because he tried to fight, and the world didn't let him. But that isn't the real secret. The real secret is the note. The doctor says it happened on a quiet, late evening at Graceland, one of the rare nights when the phones weren't ringing and the pressure wasn't pounding through the walls like a heartbeat. Elvis had called him back, not for medication, not for tests, but for something far heavier. When the doctor walked in, Elvis wasn't on the couch or the bed. He was sitting at a desk, a small piece of paper in front of him. His hands were shaking, not from medication, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "I need you to take this," Elvis whispered, "but don't show anyone. Not yet." It was a note, just a few sentences, handwritten, raw. Words that carried the truth he was too afraid to let the world see. In that note, Elvis admitted what he never said in public, that he didn't feel in control anymore, that the schedule was killing him, that the medications weren't his escape. They were the only way he'd been taught to survive the pressure, and that he was trying, really trying, to change before it was too late. But the line that broke the doctor the most was this one. "If anything happens, don't let them say I gave up. Tell Lisa I tried. Tell her the show wouldn't let me stop." The doctor held the note like it was a dying heartbeat. He wanted to argue, to tell Elvis he was being dramatic, that they'd fix things before it ever came to that. But he couldn't lie. He'd seen the damage. He'd seen the exhaustion. He'd seen the machine around Elvis tightening like a fist. Then Elvis added the part that became the doctor's burden for the next 40 years. "Don't show this while I'm alive. They'll twist it. They'll use it to tear apart everyone I care about." So the doctor promised. He didn't fully understand what he was promising, but he promised. And the guilt began there, because not long after that night, the doctor reached the breaking point. He confessed in Section 2. The last moment, he could have forced a stop. The last moment, he could have taken the note straight to the authorities, to the press, to anyone who would listen. But he didn't. And when Elvis died, the doctor's silence became a prison. He says he remembers the exact moment he heard the news. He remembers the stillness, the ringing in his ears, the first thought that shattered him. "I should have stopped this. I should have done more." The world erupted with blame, pills, indulgence, irresponsibility. People shook their heads and called Elvis tragic, reckless, self-destructive. And the doctor stood there with a note in his pocket that proved the opposite. A note that showed Elvis didn't surrender. He didn't collapse into addiction willingly. He didn't choose the outcome. He had fought, begged, tried, and been pushed until he had nothing left. But the doctor couldn't speak. Lawyers circled, management threatened, confidentiality hung over him like a noose. And he knew that if he revealed the note too early, it wouldn't protect Elvis's legacy. It would rip apart his daughter's world, fuel lawsuits, and turn the truth into ammunition. So he hid it. He kept it in a sealed envelope at the back of a drawer, opening it every year on the anniversary of Elvis's death. He read the words like a confession he couldn't offer the world. Then he pressed the paper back into hiding and carried the burden into another year. He came close to destroying it once. He'd watched another documentary that blamed Elvis for everything: his weight, his choices, his weakness. It enraged him so deeply that he took the note to the trash, ready to burn it. But something stopped him. A clip of Lisa Marie, smiling, defending her father, talking about how much he loved her, how misunderstood he was. The doctor froze. The note felt heavier than ever. He realized something painful. If he destroyed it, the world would never know the truth. Elvis needed someone, anyone, to carry for him. And if he kept it hidden forever, he'd break the only promise Elvis ever begged him to keep. So he took the note out of the trash. He smoothed the crumpled edges. He locked it away again. And he waited for the moment Elvis asked him to choose. Don't tell them until they're ready to hear it. Now, he says, the world is finally ready. And the truth he's about to reveal is the one thing that changes Elvis's story forever. He waited nearly half a lifetime for the moment when the world might finally understand Elvis, not as a headline, not as a cautionary tale, but as a human being who fought harder than anyone ever knew. And now, sitting with the note in his hands, the doctor finally says the words he has been terrified and obligated to say. This is what he wanted you to know. He unfolds the paper, smoothing its worn edges. The writing is shaky, the ink fading, but the meaning feels sharper than ever. Elvis wrote that he was scared, that he felt trapped, that he didn't know how to slow down without disappointing the people who depended on him. He admitted he was ashamed of needing help, terrified of being seen as weak, and desperate for a way to break free from the pressure that was crushing him. He wrote, "I don't want them thinking I quit on myself. I didn't. I'm trying, Doc. I swear I'm trying." The doctor's voice cracks as he reads it, because for decades the world believed the opposite. They believed Elvis spiraled. They believed he didn't care. They believed he gave up on discipline, on health, on life. But this note, this fragile, painful confession, proves that Elvis never stopped trying, even when the machine around him made trying nearly impossible. The doctor reads the next part aloud, knowing this is the line that will change everything. "Tell Lisa I wasn't running from her. Tell her I was fighting to still be here, even when the show wouldn't let me stop." That sentence breaks him every time, because he remembers the way Elvis said Lisa when he spoke about her. The softness, the pride, the fear of becoming a memory she couldn't understand. For the doctor, revealing this note is the hardest thing he's ever done, not because it condemns anyone directly, but because it reveals the truth in a way that strips away decades of myth, of judgment, of easy answers people clung to in order to make sense of his death. "I didn't speak sooner," he says, "because I knew they'd turn it into a weapon against managers, against family members, against Elvis himself. He didn't want lawsuits or scandal. He didn't want Presley's legacy ripped apart by anger instead of healed by understanding. Most of all, he didn't want Lisa Marie growing up with the world shouting accusations at her father." But over time, the silence became a wound that never closed. He watched documentaries flatten Elvis into a caricature. He watched people mock the final years. He watched fans argue about the cause of death as if the truth were a game. And with every passing year, he felt the promise he made to Elvis slipping further away. Then, he says, something changed. He saw younger fans discovering Elvis, not the icon, but the man. They asked different questions. They wanted compassion, not blame. They wanted to understand the pressure, the fame, the impossible expectations Elvis lived under. They were ready to see him as human. And that's when the doctor realized Elvis's final request had finally come true. Wait until they're ready to hear it. Now the doctor says the truth plainly. Elvis didn't destroy himself. He was destroyed by a world that demanded too much and gave him too little room to breathe. He emphasizes that this isn't about attacking individuals, though there were certainly people who pushed him too far. It's about exposing a system that treated Elvis like an endless resource instead of a living, fragile man with fears, limits, and a heart that carried the weight of millions. The note doesn't excuse every choice Elvis made, but it reframes them. It shows the internal battle behind the headlines. It reveals a man trying to claw his way back to health while being dragged toward the stage again and again. The doctor leans back, hands trembling. I couldn't save him. I failed him when it mattered most, but I can save the truth. And that's why I'm speaking now. He says he hopes fans don't walk away from this story with bitterness, but with empathy. Empathy for a man who lifted the world while carrying a mountain on his shoulders. Empathy for a father who adored his daughter. Empathy for an artist who fought harder than anyone knew. He ends with a line that feels like both confession and redemption. He wasn't weak. He wasn't careless. He was tired, and he was trying. And now, at last, the world will finally know that. If this changed how you see Elvis, tell me in the comments. Do you think stars today face the same pressures he did? Should doctors break their silence sooner when fame becomes dangerous? Share your thoughts and subscribe if you want the next untold chapter of Elvis's story.
Capitalizing or exploiting my relationship with him. So that's why I never wrote a book for almost 40 years about my relationship with Elvis.
She had stayed quiet for nearly half a century. Through interviews, documentaries, and books, Linda Thompson had smiled politely, spoken softly, and always stopped just short of telling the whole story. But at 76, her tone changed. When she finally spoke, it wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was weary. I kept that secret because I loved him, she said. And for the first time, people realized the weight she'd been carrying all those years wasn't just grief. It was the burden of something Elvis Presley had made her promise never to reveal. It began long before the tabloids ever mentioned her name. Before she was Elvis's girlfriend, Linda was a beauty queen from Memphis. A girl with Southern grace, ambition, and a sense of faith that mirrored Elvis's own. They met in 1972, only a few months after his separation from Priscilla. The king of rock and roll was lonely, restless, and desperately looking for someone who could make him feel human again. When Linda walked into his life, something shifted. She wasn't starstruck. She wasn't after fame. She saw a man, not a monument. In the beginning, their connection was effortless. Elvis was tender, attentive, and surprisingly vulnerable with her. He'd call late at night just to talk, telling stories that wandered between childhood memories and deep spiritual questions. "I feel like God put you here," he once told her, and maybe she believed it, because she stayed. Through the endless tours, the late-night rehearsals, and the sudden mood swings that could turn laughter into silence without warning. But as the months turned into years, Linda began to realize something wasn't right behind the marble gates of Graceland. The mansion everyone dreamed of visiting felt less like a palace and more like a fortress. The curtains stayed closed. The clocks meant nothing. Elvis rarely slept, drifting between gospel music and bursts of paranoia that no one outside his circle ever saw. Fame had given him everything, but peace of mind was never part of the deal. And Linda, still in her 20s, found herself living with a man the world adored, but who no longer knew how to breathe outside the legend he'd built. She'd watch him pace through the house in the early hours, whispering half prayers under his breath, staring at old photographs as if he was trying to remember who he used to be. Sometimes he'd confide in her. He'd talk about feeling chosen, cursed, tested, about seeing signs, numbers, dreams, coincidences he couldn't ignore. At first, Linda thought it was exhaustion, maybe stress. But the more he spoke, the more she realized these weren't passing thoughts. They were beliefs he clung to. And the more the world demanded Elvis the icon, the more fragile Elvis the man became. Linda stayed loyal. She defended him when friends whispered about his habits, when reporters asked too many questions, when his behavior started to shift from eccentric to alarming. To the outside world, she was the calm presence by his side. the beautiful woman who kept the king grounded. But inside Graceland, she was becoming something else entirely. The keeper of truths too heavy for anyone else to carry. And then came the night he told her the one thing she could never repeat. She wouldn't write it down. She wouldn't even tell close friends decades later. But whatever he confessed changed her forever. She said it wasn't about drugs or women or money. It was about the part of Elvis no one truly knew, the part that scared him most. After that night, every time she looked at him on stage, smiling for thousands, she saw the secret behind his eyes, the one he made her protect with her silence. Linda's life became a balancing act between devotion and denial. She loved him deeply, but the deeper that love went, the more she saw how impossible it was to save him. Still, she stayed because she believed he needed her, not as a lover, but as a witness to the man he was when the lights went out. When she finally broke her silence years later, she didn't do it for fame or closure. She did it because the secret had outlived them both. It wasn't just his health he was hiding, she said quietly. It was who he was becoming. The world had called him a king, but the man Linda knew was searching for something far greater, something he couldn't find in gold records or Graceland gates. And that was the truth she'd carried for 50 years, that Elvis Presley's greatest battle wasn't against fame or addiction or loneliness. It was against the version of himself the world refused to let die. Life inside Graceland looked perfect from the outside. Fans imagined laughter echoing through the halls, music drifting from room to room, and Elvis holding court like a Southern king. But Linda Thompson knew the truth. Behind those locked gates, time didn't move forward. It circled endlessly around the same sleepless nights, the same whispered fears, the same haunting feeling that something sacred was unraveling. Elvis lived on a schedule that belonged to no one but him. Days began at sunset. Breakfast was dinner. Visitors were chosen, not welcomed. The mansion was filled with laughter one moment and silence the next, depending on which version of Elvis woke up that night. He could be playful, quoting the Bible between jokes, playing gospel records loud enough to shake the windows. But when the music stopped, his expression changed. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by something distant, something lost. Linda became both his comfort and his anchor. She memorized his moods, learned to read the signs, the sudden stare into nothing, the muttered words about destiny, the way he'd fall into prayer at 3 in the morning, as if he were pleading with someone no one else could see. Elvis wasn't just tired, he was tormented. He spoke about God constantly, not as faith, but as a burden. He believed he'd been chosen for something divine, and yet, every night he felt himself slipping further from grace. He'd tell Linda about visions, strange coincidences, moments when he felt touched by something bigger than fame. "I'm not just here to sing," he whispered once. "I'm here to remind people there's more to life than this." But that conviction didn't bring him peace. It fractured him. Every concert, every screaming crowd only deepened the divide between the man who wanted to save souls and the performer trapped under flashing lights. Linda began to see how fame didn't just isolate him, it distorted reality itself. People around him stopped saying no. Every wish was granted instantly. Every mistake was excused. And when you're told you're special long enough, you start to wonder if maybe you really are. Elvis wasn't arrogant. He was desperate to believe it meant something, that the spotlight had a purpose, that the sacrifices weren't for nothing. She saw the cracks growing in real time, the long nights without sleep, the handfuls of pills he called medicine, the way he'd stare into mirrors and say, almost jokingly, "I don't even know who this man is anymore." Linda wanted to help, but Graceland had rules. You didn't question the king. You protected the illusion, even when the illusion was killing him. So she played her part. She smiled for photographs, answered fan mail, pretended the nights were normal. But privately, she prayed for him. Sometimes he'd collapse beside her on the couch, exhausted and trembling, confessing things no one else ever heard. He spoke of reincarnation, of past lives, of a destiny that terrified him. He believed his fame was a test and that failing it meant losing his soul. Linda never knew whether to comfort him or cry for him. The deeper she went into his world, the more she realized how lonely genius can be. Everyone wanted something from Elvis, his voice, his image, his legend. But Linda was the only one who saw what it cost. She wasn't protecting a superstar, she was protecting a man who was coming apart in slow motion. There were nights he'd sing gospel songs softly to himself, eyes closed, tears running down his face. "I used to feel God on stage," he said once. "Now I feel nothing." That line stayed with her for years because in that moment she understood the truth. He wasn't addicted to fame or music. He was addicted to meaning. And the more the world worshipped him, the more meaningless it all became. Linda wanted to believe love could save him. She cooked his meals, sat beside him during his darkest moods, and reminded him of who he used to be. But even she began to feel the pull of the illusion. Graceland was a bubble. Once you were inside, you forgot what normal felt like. Days melted together, reality blurred, and Linda, who once believed in faith and simplicity, found herself whispering the same prayers he did, half afraid that maybe he really was chosen, and that she had been chosen to protect him. But she also began to fear something else. The more she loved him, the closer she got to the truth, the one thing he didn't want her to see. The secret wasn't just about his health or his addictions, it was about the quiet transformation happening inside him. Elvis Presley, the man everyone adored, was becoming someone else entirely, someone he no longer recognized. And deep down, Linda knew it was only a matter of time before that secret consumed them both. The night he told her the truth, the house was silent. No music, no laughter, no sound but the hum of the air conditioner echoing through the walls of Graceland. Elvis sat at the edge of his bed, eyes unfocused, his hands trembling slightly. Linda had seen him tired before. She'd seen him broken. But this was different. He wasn't talking like a man anymore. He was confessing like someone who believed his time was running out. He told her there were things the world could never understand, things he couldn't say out loud because no one would believe him. He said fame wasn't a blessing, it was a curse, a test he was failing. He believed God had given him his gift to heal people, to bring light, to remind the lost that they weren't alone. But somewhere along the way, he said, he'd used the light wrong. He talked about visions, about dreams where he saw himself standing in white, speaking to crowds that vanished into mist. "I think I'm being punished," he whispered. "I think I let him down." Linda tried to calm him, to pull him back to the present, but his eyes stayed fixed on something invisible. That's when he made her promise, never to tell anyone what he'd said. "They'll think I've lost my mind," he told her. "But you know me. You've seen it. You know this is real." She nodded, because what else could she do? She loved him, and in that moment, she understood that keeping his secret wasn't just loyalty, it was mercy. After that night, everything changed between them. Elvis became gentler, almost fragile, but there was also a new edge to him, a quiet desperation. He'd spend hours reading spiritual books, talking about reincarnation, numerology, and the Bible as if they were all pieces of the same hidden map. "I've been here before," he said one night. "I can feel it. Like I'm living the same story over again, just in a different skin." Linda listened, afraid to challenge him. She didn't see madness. She saw a man drowning in his own brilliance, searching for meaning in a world that demanded he be nothing but a performer. She saw him pray for hours, asking God to forgive him for things he couldn't name. And every time he walked on stage afterward, smiling and bowing, she wondered if anyone in the crowd could see what she saw. The trembling under the surface, the exhaustion in his soul. The secret she was keeping wasn't about scandal or shame. It was about identity. Elvis Presley, the most famous man on earth, was losing himself to a belief that both terrified and comforted him. He thought he'd been chosen for something divine, but he also feared he'd failed that purpose, that his fame was proof he'd traded faith for vanity. "I can't tell what's real anymore," he told her once. "The music, the crowds, the love, it all feels like a dream I can't wake up from." Linda wanted to help him, but the deeper his spiritual confusion grew, the more isolated he became. He stopped trusting the people around him. He saw signs in everything: the color of the sky, a number on a clock, a lyric in a song. He'd whisper, "That means something," as if decoding a message only he could hear. And through it all, she stayed silent, terrified of breaking the fragile peace between them. There were moments when she thought he might be healing. They'd laugh, reminisce, share quiet dinners where he seemed almost normal again. But then, something would trigger the darkness. A dream, a song, a sudden silence. He'd look at her, his voice trembling, and say, "Promise me you'll protect it. Promise me they'll never know." And she always did, because by then, she wasn't just keeping his secret, she was living inside it. The pressure of that silence began to crush her. Friends noticed she'd grown distant, quieter. They thought it was exhaustion, but Linda was carrying the weight of two souls, hers and his. Every time she spoke to outsiders, she edited herself carefully, guarding words that could unravel his legend. She knew that if anyone ever found out what he truly believed about himself, they wouldn't see faith, they'd see madness. And that was what Elvis feared most. Not death, not loneliness, but being remembered as a man who'd lost his mind. So she stayed quiet, even as he slipped further away, even as the pills dulled his spirit and the world around him blurred. The promise she'd made became a prison, but she never broke it. Because deep down, Linda understood something no one else did: that the king of rock and roll wasn't destroyed by fame or addiction. He was destroyed by belief, by the unbearable idea that he'd been chosen by God and somehow failed him. And that was the darkest secret of all. When Elvis died, the world mourned a legend. Fans lined the streets outside Graceland, weeping as if a family member had been taken from them. But inside, behind the closed doors and drawn curtains, Linda Thompson sat in silence. She had lost something the public would never understand. They'd lost an icon. She'd lost a man who had trusted her with the most fragile part of himself, and now that secret belonged to her alone. For years, she refused interviews that wanted dirt or drama. People wanted to hear about pills, about women, about scandals. But Linda always redirected the conversation. "He was a deeply spiritual man," she'd say softly. That was her line. Always gentle, always vague. Because how could she explain the truth without shattering the image millions still worshipped? How could she tell them that Elvis hadn't died as a sinner lost in excess, but as a man convinced he'd disappointed God? In private, the guilt never left her. Every time she saw his face on a poster, every time a documentary replayed his smile, she felt the weight of his final confession pressing against her chest. She'd promised him the world would never know. And for decades she kept that promise, out of love, out of fear, and maybe out of something deeper: reverence. Years passed. The myth of Elvis grew larger, more distant. Fans turned his life into legend and his pain into poetry. But Linda couldn't join in the nostalgia. She knew what the lights had cost him. She'd seen the nights when he'd kneel on the carpet, begging for a sign that he hadn't been forgotten by God. She'd heard the words he whispered between prayers, the doubt that haunted him long before fame ever did. By the time Linda reached her 70s, she had spent more time without Elvis than with him. Yet his presence had never really left. Every anniversary, every headline, every impersonator on a Vegas stage, it was all a reminder that the man she'd loved still lived in fragments scattered across the world. But none of those fragments carried the truth. Not the one she kept locked inside. When she finally spoke about it, she did so carefully. not as a revelation, but as a release. Her voice trembled, not with drama, but with compassion. He wasn't hiding sin, she said. He was hiding pain. He was fighting himself. She explained that Elvis had believed his gift was divine, that every song, every performance was meant to heal people. But when fame turned that gift into a burden, he began to believe he'd failed his purpose. He thought he'd disappointed God, she said quietly. That was the real tragedy. He didn't die thinking he was a king. He died thinking he wasn't worthy. Her words changed everything. They didn't make him smaller. They made him human again. For the first time, fans saw beyond the glitter and the jumpsuits. They saw a man who had carried the weight of millions on his shoulders, while doubting whether he deserved any of it. Linda didn't tell the story for sympathy. She told it because she understood something that only time could teach, that love sometimes means silence, and sometimes it means truth. For 50 years, she had been the guardian of his secret, protecting the man behind the myth. But now, with age softening her voice, she finally chose to free both of them from it. She spoke of how, in his last years, Elvis had found brief moments of peace, late at night, singing gospel songs not for the stage, but for himself. That's how I want to remember him, she said. Not the headlines, not the chaos, just Elvis, sitting in the dark, singing to God like a child asking to be let back home. And maybe that was his truest legacy. Not the fame, not the fortune, but the faith that refused to die, even when everything else did. Linda's revelation didn't tarnish his memory, it completed it. The king who once seemed larger than life was finally understood as he truly was. A man who believed his soul was borrowed, and his voice was meant for something divine. A man who spent his final years not chasing applause but searching for forgiveness. And the woman who loved him, who kept his secret when the world wasn't ready to hear it, became the final witness to his humanity. Because sometimes, the most sacred truth isn't the one that makes a man famous. It's the one that reminds the world he was human all along. Some stories aren't about what was lost, but what was finally understood. If this truth about Elvis moved you, explore the next chapter. At 85, Elvis's former bodyguard finally speaks out. He wasn't the man you think. Subscribe now and keep discovering the hidden hearts behind the legends we thought we knew.